Would you like to join a conversation with the iPhreaks and their guests? Want to support the show? We have a form that allows you to join the conversation and support the show at the same time. You can sign up at iPhreakshow.com/forum. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 61 of the iPhreaks Show. This week on our panel we have Pete Hodgson.
Good morning from sunny San Francisco.
James Zuber.
Hello from sunny Minneapolis.
Alondo Brewington.
Hello from North Carolina.
Charles Max Wood from DevChat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, Tony Ingraldi.
Hello from Yorktown, Virginia.
All right, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Sure. I'm Tony Ingraldi, as you've said. Been working in software for a very long time. I go back to the 80s, actually, in starting my software career. And I've traveled kind of a long and winding road through various technologies to get where I am. One odd detour that I think I took at an early age, even back in the 80s, I had kind of an affinity for computers, but in spite of that, I went ahead and became an aerospace engineer, thinking, well, gee, that would be a natural thing to do, sure. So I went to work for NASA here in Hampton, Virginia, at NASA Langley Research Center, worked there for about 18 years, and midway into that career there, switched gears pretty much full-time, went into software engineering from aerospace engineering, still kind of attached to the aerospace world, working, creating sort of enterprisey in-house apps for the wind tunnel testing community, that sort of thing, and working in, Java, Python, that sort of thing. And then somewhere along the way in there, came in contact with web objects, which was my first taste of kind of Apple, really the next style of development. The Cocoa framework was with their rendition of the Cocoa framework for the web, which was kind of eye-opening. It was a whole different way to develop and was quite enjoyable. Left NASA about almost 10 years ago now, and have kind of been hopping around doing different sorts of things at startups. And lately, for about the past year, been working as kind of a solopreneur with Majesty Software, doing consulting work. I've been working a bit with Role Model Software based in North Carolina, doing some local work here for different clients, and having a lot of fun working on iPhone and iPad.
Cool.
I've not heard solopreneur before. I like that.
I didn't invent that. I've heard it somewhere else, but I like it too.
Yeah, I've heard it before. It's also Alondo's first time on the show. Do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you. Alondo Brewington. I'm a mobile developer with a company called TeamSnap. We do team and organizational management, primarily in sports, although we will allow you to manage whatever type of team organization you'd like. It's based out of Boulder, Colorado. Been an iOS developer since 2010. Before that, I was doing Windows development, primarily in C#, a little bit of VB, and before that, Delphi. So kind of a long history in some Pascal-type languages. I've started doing mobile development, and I've not looked back. I've tried solo development as well, do a little contract work in the past. Now I'm solely focused on teamwork at TeamSnap and a couple of solo apps that I just have in the App Store myself.
Awesome. We're glad to have you.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, the topic for today is UI TableView and table views in general. And when I was introduced to Tony over email, it was Ken Auer, and he actually mentioned that you guys have done some work. You gave a talk about table views. You've done some work on your own TableView library. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and kind of give us an introduction on where we're going to be going with this? Because it seems like tables are more or less pretty straightforward, generally.
So, yeah, they are. There's nothing really mysterious in a table view. It's a very common user interface idiom that's going to be in pretty much any app, except maybe for a game. But what I guess over time, I've just been using them kind of out of the box, UI table views, with the most obvious way to implement two of the key methods there that deal with, what cell should be displayed at a given row, and then what happens when you tap at a given cell. And the most obvious implementation, just doing what the framework kind of supplies, you end up with, for complicated table views anyway, you end up with a kind of a really nasty set of conditionals driving the logic in the cell provision and cell tapping methods. And, for the simple case, you have a single section, a single type of cell. It's really clean. But as soon as you get anything where you have a different type of cell coming in, or if you want different actions to happen based when the cell is tapped, that's when you start getting really tangled up. And the best way I could describe my history with it is I kind of developed a blind spot for this. I generally have a very high, well, I still do. I have a very high appreciation for what Apple has done in their framework. So there's nothing like it on other platforms where it just seems like it's so consistent over such a long period of time across a wide breadth of different capabilities. So I generally don't look at what they supply with a critical eye and say, well, gee, that's not the right way to do it. Let's do something else. So I developed this blind spot where I just would write this really nasty code and kind of hold my nose and move on. And you'd end up with, in some cases, just really, just long, very long methods, which is very counter to what I would normally do. It's kind of thing, if I had gone in and designed it from scratch, I never would have come up with what you end up doing by default in a table view. So in interacting with Ken Auer, at Role Model Software, we were having a kind of an iOS team meeting one day, and Ken would not allow Apple to get by with that. So, and I showed him some of the code I had written, and he actually jokingly asked me, was I able to sleep the night that I wrote it? Because it was just so hard. And I said, well, actually, I probably wasn't sleeping because I was writing it up late one night. But anyway, so we started talking back and forth, and he said, no, look, we really need to clean this up, and let's just introduce the notion of a section. It's such an obvious thing in hindsight, but until you bring that in, you're kind of jumping a gap from a table to a cell, and there's nothing in the middle that kind of contains the cells. And it really there should be a section object out of the box, and I'm not sure why it's not there. I mean, if you look in storyboards rather, there's a hint of a section in some of the way the UI lays out, but there's no corresponding object in the framework that you can actually put your hands on. So Ken had that really good insight, and he said, hey, let's just introduce a section object. And so I went on my way and created there's a GitHub project called RMS TableViews that encapsulates this idea. And it takes it one step further when you, not just introducing section, but when it gets into really supporting the really hairy situations with things like settings views and data editing and things like that, where you typically have, just a wide variety of cells interacting with some controller logic. And it tends to get really, if you do it, like I said, out of the box, if you do it in the most straightforward implementation style, you're going to end up with just really, really messy code that's hard to look at, hard to maintain. And it just becomes, things just kind of not fall apart, but they fall into place rather when you introduce the section. And, so if you're asking for a cell at an index path, which is kind of hints at, hey, it's a section in a row, you just naturally defer to the section and say, hey, give me either cell for this row. And it just becomes a lot cleaner, and it gets rid of really two of the nastiest parts about table views. And what ends up happening is all that bookkeeping kind of goes away, and you're left with your core business logic. What makes your app versus what, supplying details about cells. It's hard to describe in words. It's much easier to see it. So in a podcast format, I'm not sure how best to convey the real impact of it, because it's hard to, like I said, hard to describe the before and after unless you've seen it. Unless, if you've done this sort of development, you know what I'm talking about. You've probably felt the pain, but you probably can't appreciate the full impact of just looking at it in a slightly different way without seeing it. So I'm not sure how we convey that.
Can you describe a little bit about what you mean by a section? Yeah,
a section basically is a grouping of cells. So you might have, say on a settings view, you might have, it would naturally fall into groups on your group table view. You'd have different sections with, might have username, password, and then you'll have maybe a middle section with some data about a user, and then you'll have maybe a section down below where you got a save button or a submit button or something like that. So that would be a user editing view. So basically it's a grouping of cells is a section. So instead of jumping the gap between table view to cell, because you're dealing with index paths, which have two components to them, you're basically supplying an object intermediate between the table view and the cell to just naturally encapsulate or contain all of the elements that are there.
Is the role of the kind of form section or the form? Sorry, I'm looking at your GitHubs and
okay,
reading through the classes and stuff. So is the role of this form section to kind of encapsulate the layout logic, or is it for UI, or is it to hold kind of the logic behind, let's say you have like a login screen that has either login or sign up. So I guess that would be like two sections. There'd be like the login section and then the sign up for a new account section. Would that be a good kind of way of modeling it?
Yeah, this approach is not dealing with the pixel positioning of anything. It's not a UI layout thing in that sense. It's the arrangement of your cells. It's the higher level arrangement of your cells in the table view.
Gotcha.
And it's still, it leverages things. You can design a cell. If you want to have a custom cell, you can design the whole thing in Interface Builder and use a custom, nib-based cell if you'd like. So it doesn't do away with that. It's not a replacement for Interface Builder in that regard. It's really just to address the bookkeeping tedium that generally accompanies complicated tables. Some of this you can get with a static table in storyboards. My issue with storyboards, though, I have a couple things. I guess I haven't fully jumped on board the storyboard train, although that train seems to be picking up speed more and more now. So I'll probably get on board. But the couple of things that I don't like about it, just inherently, I don't like. It just seems wrong to have your entire UI, or it seems to be asking to have your entire UI in one file. And I always found that kind of odd. And now you can break it up and do things, but you lose some of the benefit when you do that. And also one thing I found odd is if you want to have, let's say, a custom cell layout in two different table views in a storyboard, I've not seen a way to do that where you don't have to copy and paste, the entire cell layout from one table view to another. So that seemed to be counter to just normal accepted practice of not repeating things in more than one place. And, those might be small corner cases, and I'm sure at some point Apple will introduce something where you can solve those problems. And then aside from that, I just never found the benefit of specifying segues to be so overwhelming. Being able to specify that in a storyboard versus just dealing with a little bit of code. I didn't see a real huge payoff there. So anyway, we went this way with what we call the form descriptor, which is basically a plist, or it could be JSON format. And one interesting thing that opens up that you can't do with storyboards, at least not that I'm aware of, if you want, you could actually defer the final layout of your UI until runtime. You could have, say, a backend service vending a JSON description of your UI, and you might have, say, different flavors for different user privilege levels, for instance. That would be one way to you could vend your UI from the back end and have it dynamically rendered at runtime based on that description, that serialized description. I've not personally leveraged that, but the opportunity is there to do that. So, it did open up some ideas in that regard. And again, I found it to be extremely useful because I have had opportunity to use this framework in an app, since it was created. And it was night and day, the development experience of just being able to not deal with just the tedium that you get into, and again, that large conditional driven structure that tends to be ugly to look at and maintain. And it was kind of like night and day. You just describe your interface. I want this cell here. I want this cell here, this cell here. And voila, the magic happens. And it's similar to other ideas in, other technologies. One thing I came across years ago in the Java space, something called, SwixML, which is very similar in its purpose. Basically, it's an XML user interface description. There's a little bit more swingish, and it's for swing apps, but, the same kind of idea. You basically serialize a bunch of code that normally you would write. If you've ever done any kind of swing development or any user development, user interface development where you're laying out things in code, that code tends to be very verbose, very tedious, and really it's just data. It's just describing an interface. And so this is kind of the analog to that in iOS, although it doesn't deal with, where pixels go on the screen. It's strictly dealing with the ordering of cells and what happens when you interact with the cell, when you tap on a cell.
Can you walk us through a little bit on how you would set up these sections we talked about, maybe a login and a sign-in form? How are we doing it differently now than kind of the old way?
If you adopt this approach, particularly if you adopt RMS table views, you would basically be describing the arrangement of your cells in a plist format. So you'd be editing a data file, essentially. And you're probably going to create some custom cells along the way. And then, for good measure, we threw in several kind of out-of-the-box cells, things like text entry cells and switch cells. So if you want to represent a Boolean value, you just use a switch cell. I think that's what we called it. So common things, if you want to pick from a list, we have an array picker cell, so you just supply it basically an array of objects that you want to pick from. So you would basically just be describing in this data file, in this plist, this hierarchical arrangement of your sections and your cells and your code. If you use everything out of the box, for instance, for a settings view, if you don't have any custom cells beyond what's supplied in the framework, you almost have no code. And I actually, in the part of the demo I did, the CocoaConf talk, was we showed how to build, say, the Siri interface, the Siri settings interface from, basically looked exactly like what's built into the phone. And we had essentially no code. I mean, it was almost an empty class in the end that, because it was leveraging, NS user defaults for saving data and things like that. So it was extremely brief in terms of the actual Objective-C code, because it all ended up being just describing your interface. And I imagine this is very similar to what Apple must do with settings bundles, because basically you're just giving it data. You're saying, hey, this describes my UI, or this describes the set of preferences I need to be surfaced. And the settings bundle, all you supply is a bundle. You don't supply UI. So I imagine behind the scenes, Apple's doing something similar. I imagine there's quite a bit of difference, but the concept is the same.
So we've got like a P list where we're saying, okay, I need a Boolean field here if we want to save the user's password. So I've got a little thing that I can put in the P list. Username, I've got like a text field thing. So you've got like a bunch of canned little things that you can put in, drop in to make your kind of entry form. Right.
And it takes advantage of key value coding to bind the data to the UI element. And it's two-way. So if you change the data, the UI would change. If you change the UI, the data would change. So it's not, I don't think it's quite as complete as bindings on OS X, but it's a similar idea where you're not having to write a lot of extra code to do that. You just basically declare properties, and, key value coding machinery does most of the work there.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about having like a custom nib. Is there a way I can integrate a custom nib for a cell?
Yes. When your cell subclasses there's a method they can override to specify what what nib describes their interface, or there was an alternate constructor. I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but basically, yes. The short answer is yes, you can do that. There's provision for that. And there's some of the samples in the framework itself actually do that.
It sounds somewhat similar, at least in concept, to like monotouch dialogue, which was available when I first started developing, 3.5 years ago, where you could do something similar, or it was more of a code-driven thing. Mm-hmm. And it was started off in like the Xamarin monotouch ecosystem. I think it's been ported to Objective-C, but similar, where you just kind of define your objects in code. Is it an influence, or you kind of come to it on a separate?
I actually wasn't aware of that one. I know there are other toolkits out that allow you to do things like in-app settings kit, I think, is one. There are similar ideas. I didn't see any that had the pure plist or something similar to, like a serialized script that basically removes a lot of that boilerplate code from the code. To me, that the best way to express that sort of thing is just as a serialized form, as a data file, a resource of some kind, and not put it in the actual Objective-C code. So again, there's more and more CocoaPods and GitHub projects popping up all the time. So there may be something out there that's very similar at this point, but I didn't see anything that was quite like what I was trying to get at with this one. And that's really just getting a total separation of the description of the layout of the ordering of the cells and the type of cells and the bindings from the code. I wanted to keep the code as free of that as possible. And I think we've gotten at a pretty good place. It's still a 1.0 point whatever. We haven't made a huge advance since the initial implementation, but I think it does achieve nearly all of what we were trying to do. And I've had, like I said, I've had opportunity to use it on a couple projects since it was originally written. So I've tweaked it a little bit here and there to add some extra little helpers and things. But I think fundamentally, I think it's pretty sound, and I think it would be useful to people if they're looking for kind of an alternate way to deal with these things.
Speaking of that setup with regard to binding that data to those custom cells, I was curious about using it in this format, for instance, with an edit form, and being able to have a custom cell that may actually have a few actions that are tied to buttons inside of the custom cell. Is that something that would be supported, or would that require a little extra work on our part to sort of get these actions back out via selector or delegates or things like that?
Yeah, if you want to have stuff in the cell beyond what the table view would do, there's a couple different provisions in there. One is, with this approach, you tend to make the cells smarter. They can actually contain some logic in there, which is a little bit unusual, since you think of a cell as, well, gee, that's a UI element. Why is it doing anything beyond just presenting itself? But there's nothing tremendously intense going on there. But we do have cells like, I think there's a target action cell, which is pretty generic. You can, bind that to anything, but that would be a single action for the tap. That wouldn't be doing things like sub-cell level. I think at the sub-cell level, you're going to want to have some custom logic or custom cell subclass to handle that sort of thing. Off the top of my head, I don't know if there's an obvious way to handle that other than having custom logic at the cell level. because you need to get access to the guts there. And one of the tricky parts is, these sorts of things, if you have a dynamic table where you're reusing cells, I guess you have to be a little bit careful there, but the form types table views tend to be, fixed. There's a fixed number of rows. So you can treat the cells as long-lived and not being recycled. And there's not going to be, 3,000 of them. There's going to be 10 of them, it'll be a long form. So I think you can, in that case, it makes sense, and it's somewhat safe, so to speak, to put some smarts in the cell itself. But when you get into reuse, if you're dequeuing cells in a dynamic type situation, then it could get a little hairier, but it's probably still solvable. But my experience has been you tend to not have a lot of wildly different cells in a dynamic table. It was, for instance, you're looking at, I don't know, just a list of N widgets or names or whatever it is. Those long, dynamic tables tend to be the same type of cell over and over and over again. Although that's not a hard and fast rule. And it's really where you have the more complicated situation in terms of cell content tends to be the smaller fixed form type things. So I think it works, it can work if I'm understanding what you're describing, I think it can work in that case if you put enough smarts in the cell itself.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. I think it's just a matter of the situation that we're having with the edit cell is very custom and it's an edge case. But I agree that for the most part, this sounds like something that we could. My colleague had gone to the CocoaConf and brought back some of the ideas, although we're not using RMS table views exclusively or specifically. I definitely think it's something we should reconsider. Right.
Yeah, and if you can use it, great. Just the concept of introducing the section was really kind of the linchpin for the thing, and everything else just kind of followed as a consequence of that.
So what other features does this have? We talked about the ability to add sections, easily add, boolean text fields. Is there any way that I can add kind of validation? Let's say I want an email address. I want to verify that. Is there a hook I can put in there? Is that supported?
There's nothing specific for validation. That would be probably a really good extension to it, to add some kind of standard mechanism for validation. Maybe just use some naming convention for methods, like validate X or whatever. Kind of I think Core Data does some of that, if I'm not mistaken. So something analogous to that would be helpful. We don't have anything built in there right now for that, so it would be an extension, either a generalized extension that would be, applicable to a large class of things, or obviously if you adopt this framework, you could just implement whatever you need to on top of that. But there's no generic support in there for that at the moment.
As it stands today, if I wanted to implement something like that, where would I put that code? Would I need to put it in my regular view controller, or is there some way I could subclass one of the framework, the library classes, or what would I do there?
I think the view controller could be a good spot for that. And it might be good to have maybe a model layer inserted in there, with some maybe a generic model class that provided a validation API. I'd have to think about that some more, before I could say for sure. It seems like a model layer would be sensible. Kind of like I said, it's like a generic model base or maybe a category, so it could be used on different base classes, because a lot of apps already have a model in place. So
sure.
Yeah, so maybe implementing a protocol and following some naming convention, kind of like, validate property name kind of thing. And yeah, somewhere between a protocol and probably apply to the model layer would be where that makes sense.
I'm not sure I totally, and I very much sympathize with trying to explain this over a podcast, because it's the kind of thing where you want to leap up to a whiteboard or crack open Xcode or something. So what are the hooks for me to kind of interact between, so let's say the login example again. As a user, I filled in my username and password, and then I tap, the login button. Where do I put the logic that is going to eventually go and make a network call and then update the UI to say, invalid password or something like that?
Well, the intermediate logic, that's dealing with the action, say, when you tap on the login button, that would be in the table view controller. I would separate the actual logic that goes out to the network into probably a separate network client of some sort. But yeah, the glue in between, we'd probably have a target action cell. Your action button would be something like login action, and then it would take the user input and do what it needs to do and sends it to the client, and then you get the result back and surface an alert or whatever, you move to the next view if it logs in successfully, whatever you need to do there. But the target, the action, the initial action would most likely be on the UI TableView controller subclass that's tied to that view. Yeah.
Gotcha. And so that target action is the kind of the mechanism for bridging from like this kind of declarative, like I've set up the UI, to handling, to actually doing stuff based on interactions.
Right. And you would declare, your target could be the view controller, it could be something else, but in many cases it's just going to be the view controller itself. And so your target would be self, and then the action, for the action in the descriptor, you just give it the string form, the name of the selector basically, and then the underlying logic would actually turn that into a real selector and invoke it. It's pretty wide open what you can do there. It's just a target action type concept that's similar to what you see in Interface Builder. So you could do anything you need to there based on a tap. What you don't have to deal with is which row was tapped, what should I do now?
Yeah.
Should I deselect the row? That kind of thing. That's just kind of all handled, and you just basically implement what you need to implement, which is the login itself.
Neat.
Yeah, we need like a holographic podcast that we can, so we can show this stuff.
Yeah, of course, the beauty of the podcast is you can plug in your headphones and drive down the road. So
that's true. And I'm a big fan of podcasts. It's just some things are just hard to convey.
Yes.
Yeah. We just need self-driving cars.
There we go. Or somebody that does screencasts on iOS. Who do we know? So are there any other aspects of this that we haven't touched on?
Well, we spent a lot of time on the form aspect, and it also handles kind of the simpler case where you're just dealing with just different sections in a table view, and it could be say something like your contacts. If you look in the contacts app, it's different sections with everything's sorted by first letter of last name, for instance. And you could also deal with that case. It's not just for the form style user interface. It's really it can be dealt anytime you're faced with you have more than one section in your table view. Then it comes in handy, because then you literally create a section for each of those sections, a section object, versus just dealing with the index path, section and row. And it cleans up the bookkeeping to the point where you don't even think about it. So even in those simple cases, it's handy because it keeps the code cleaner, and your sections are your sections, and you don't have to make that leap that there's like an air gap, so to speak, between the table view controller and all the way down to the cell, when there's this notion of section in between. It's just it never explicitly made it into an object level thing in the built-in framework. So yeah, I mean, it's not just for the form controllers. It's for any time you have more than the simplest case, and the simplest case being you have one section and one type of cell. Because in that case, there's never any hairy logic involved there. But as soon as you introduce, hey, I've got two sections, or more than one, and it may not be extreme when you just have a couple and you have just two branched conditional, but you're on your way to some pain if you continue down that path. And it just gets rid of it. It's just a simple notion of introducing a section object, and instead of the table view trying to do, if else, it just says, hey, section, I have a list of sections or an array of sections, and I just want to ask section X for its cell at X. And it's really fundamentally very simple, but it's pretty profound in the impact it can have on the cleanliness of your code and the maintainability, and just keeping it nice for people that have to come behind you and maintain it. So
it's neat that it works for dynamic stuff as well.
Yeah, either case. And that's actually the case that Ken was primarily concerned with. When we were talking about this problem, I immediately jumped to the form, because I recently had done kind of the mother of all horrible conditional driven form views, and it's like, wow, yeah, I could really clean that up. So I went ahead and attacked that, and kind of in retrospect, or backed out a little bit of that, refactored it to handle the simple case. It was somewhat of an afterthought, but I think it's factored pretty well to do that cleanly as well.
Yeah, I've got to say, I've always felt like I'm doing it wrong when I'm building table views, because there's so much low-level bookkeeping, and I've always suspected that there's something I'm doing, I'm just doing things the wrong way, but maybe it's just that I should have been using this thing before.
Well, I think what's happened is if you look at all the samples and just the way the framework is, the iOS frameworks are built for UI table view control, the way the data source and the delegate protocols are written, really the kind of the most natural thing to do is to fall into that that pattern where you have that single entry point, self row at index path. And if you never leave that, all your logic is in self row at index path. The odds are you're going to have very clumsy and messy, just this big conditional structure in some form or another. And then some people can work, I've seen it worked around where maybe they build a dictionary ahead of time with index paths as the keys and some other, maybe a method as the value, a section of that method name. And it's that's one way to clean it up, but that doesn't get you as clean as it can be. So really, again, just this notion of section, just introduce that and voila, the fog clears and it becomes really clean.
Yeah, it's very easy to have like a 300-line self or index, self or row at index path,
Right.
I've also seen people do things like, subclassing different cell components that create the different type of cells. If you have a complex thing, that's another way to keep it in check a little bit. But I definitely like the declarative, throw it in a plist, especially the simple things that are just boilerplate code anyway.
Right.
I think the thing that always irks me about the TableView thing is not just that switch statement or if statement or whatever, it's that you have it twice, right? So if you have for building the cells and then for responding to someone tapping on the cells.
Right. Yeah, those are generally the 2 points that are going to be with trouble areas. Did select cell or whatever it is for index path and cell for index path. And they're tied together, so you end up having similar conditional structures in both.
Yeah.
Although not identical. Generally speaking, they wouldn't be identical. But yeah, this just removes that. You don't have that. It just goes away completely. To the point where you don't even implement those methods. For instance, if you adopt RMS form view controller, you don't even see those methods in your implementation. They're just not there. You're implementing the action methods and, well, really that's it. It's just you're really down to what does your app do and almost nothing else.
So when are you going to port all of this to Swift?
Swift is definitely on my list of things to jump into. I'm looking forward to it, but I haven't had enough cycles to go there. And I imagine it'll be a slow migration.
Yeah.
To Swift as new things are added.
I think the best things that we're going to see in the short term with Swift is people writing nice, little DSLs on top of existing kind of open source tools. So just for this thing, for example, I can imagine someone building something so that you can configure the sections and the things inside the sections using code rather than using, a plist or a JSON file. And because Swift has those nice syntax for anonymous, for closures and stuff like that, I think there's going to be a lot of little internal DSLs that help you build things like table views.
Right. And on that note, I guess I've neglected. You can, if you choose, describe the interface in code and using, dictionary literals or however you want to construct your description there. But so it does allow for that. My natural tendency is to go for the serialized version just to keep it out of the code. But you do have that option. You can generate it. You can actually generate your form interface dynamically if you choose to. So it's kind of it's a long way around, but you can do that. You have that flexibility because it all boils down to it's constructing a dictionary or a higher it's instantiating all the plist objects into dictionaries and arrays in the end. So that's what gets fed to the main constructor. So you can describe it in code if you choose to.
I do think you're right in the implementation of the section because that's one place where we've already gained a huge benefit setting that up. And we are using dictionary literals right now, but that may change in the future. But just not having to look at those lines and lines of code right now in the view controllers has been really, really helpful. And it's made a lot, not just easier for us to focus on what we should be doing in that particular view controller, but debugging as well. Just having to jump through tons and tons of code. Is there an opportunity if there was a fork, for instance, if someone were to add some additional table cells or custom to fork that or submit a pull request to that? Is that are you actively reviewing the repo?
We haven't had any pull requests yet, but they're welcome. It'd be great if we can get more contributors. And one thing I've been kind of not as complete as I'd like to be is in the documentation area. Because even when I went back and used this thing myself a couple months after I'd written it, I kept having to go back to the code and see how does it actually work. So that's not a good sign. So yeah, pull requests are welcome for enhancements and in code or documentation. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fork and pull.
All right. Anything else before we get to the picks?
Unless if you guys don't have any itching questions, I don't have anything. I don't think to add. I think we've covered it pretty broadly there.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and do the picks then. James, do you want to start us with picks?
Sure. As some of you are aware, there's a rather large soccer tournament on right about now. And even when this actually airs in a week or so, there will still be a large soccer tournament on. But if you're in the United States like I am, and you don't have cable TV, you're kind of out of luck. You're either going to a bar, or you're calling your friends with cable and inviting yourself over. That's kind of lame, because ABC and ESPN have English language rights to all the broadcasts, and they're not giving it away for free. So it goes. But they do not have the access rights for the Spanish broadcasts. So you can download the Univision Deportes app and watch, I think, most of the games. It's in Spanish, which makes it more awesome, because, just kicking a ball around. How much do you actually need to know about the game? and you get the goal, which is the highlight of the whole game for me. So if you're in the U.S., don't have cable, Univision Deportes. That's my pick for today.
All right. Pete, what are your picks?
I always just want a plus one, James. Yeah, there's lots of people who've been watching Univision around. A lot more people watching Univision around where I live than normal. I've got some interesting picks today. So, it's Pride Week in San Francisco this week. And so I'm going to pick Alan Turing. Alan Turing is, hopefully to people, very, very famous computer science guy. He helped kind of shorten World War II by quite a substantial period of time, saving lots and lots and lots of people's lives by kind of breaking the Enigma code. He also invented the idea of the Turing test, which I think recently was allegedly kind of passed, but I'm not sure if that's true. He also, really incredibly smart computer science guy who also happened to be gay and was persecuted for that by the British government and killed himself because of that, which is really sad. So, I don't know, I just like to pick him. It's kind of a bit trivial to pick someone so important, but I'm going to pick him anyway. On a lighter note, I'm going to do an anti-pick for Twitter Bootstrap. I see lots of people using Bootstrap. You can actually use it the right way, but not that many people do, and they don't really tell people how to use it the right way. If you're tempted to use Twitter Bootstrap, just don't, and look at some alternatives. A really good alternative is Bourbon and Neat from ThoughtBot. So look at that first before using Twitter Bootstrap. And my last pick is a beer pick. I'm going to pick a limited release from Lagunitas, which is called Nighttime. Normally, I like to pick the session beers. Lagunitas have a beer called Daytime, which is a session beer. Nighttime is not a session beer. Nighttime is 8.2% alcohol. And it's really yummy. It's like a very dark kind of coffee and toffee kind of beer, but it's still got the kind of the grapefruit going on because it's Lagunitas. It's very good. If you can get it where you live, then I recommend trying it out. That's my picks.
All right. Alonso, what are your picks?
I have two. The first one is an app called Moves. It's the Moves app, movesapp.com. You can find it in the App Store. I'm not aware of Fitbits or any other type of fitness wearable, but I was curious to know how much I was moving or not moving while I'm working or during the week. And I've discovered that I really do need to get mobile. And the Moves app has helped out a lot because it just allows me to trace the steps that I've had and also where I've been. So one of the nice things I've done is just sort of taken a daily walk around the neighborhood to track my steps, increase the amount of fitness, I guess, at some level. So it's a great app. I know there are lots of other apps that track, but this one is free, and it's a really neat app, and it's quite helpful. My second pick is probably the antithesis to that, and it is a beer. It is the Duck Rabbit Milk Stout from the Duck Rabbit Brewery here in North Carolina. Support local breweries. It's a great, great beer. You could probably find it in a few places. I've been traveling a good bit and found it in local brew shops. So it's a delicious stout if you like stouts. Those are my picks.
Awesome. So I hadn't even thought about picks because my life's been so crazy lately. So I'm going to pass, and let's hear Tony's picks.
All right. I actually have a bunch because I was afraid I wouldn't have any, so then I probably went and got too many. But on the tech front, I've got one that's kind of an old and trusted friend. It's an app called Text Wrangler, which has its roots back in the BB Edit product line. It goes back 2 decades at least, I think. So I just find myself using it quite a bit, just for the here and there, just editing quick edits, and I don't want to fire up Xcode. My go-to editor is Text Wrangler, and I recommend it. Then on the entertainment front, although I hesitate to call it entertainment because it's entertainment with a purpose. I'm a big fan of the Kendrick brothers and their films. And some of the more well-known ones are things like Facing the Giants, Fireproof, and Courageous. And films that'll make you think and challenge you in what you believe. And I'm a big fan. And as far as podcasts, I'm a big fan of Dave Ramsey and his Financial Peace University, and he's got the Dave Ramsey Show podcast, and also kind of go hand in hand with that, Entree Leadership from his crew also. And on the solopreneur front, Dan Miller is a good podcast. It's 48 Days, and those are all pretty well-known podcasts, and I find myself listening to them quite often, and just find a lot of encouragement and ideas and all of that stuff.
Yeah, you picked some of my favorites too. We actually had Dan Miller on the Freelancer Show. So
you did? Oh, wow.
Still working on Dave Ramsey. Yeah, terrific shows. Good picks. All right, well, we'll go ahead and wind down the podcast. Thanks for coming again, Tony.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking.
We'll catch you all next week. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.